We lay, my love and I, beneath a weeping willow, but now alone I lie. Oh, willow, I die. Oh, willow, I die.
Henry James's 1898 Gothic novella, The Turn of the Screw, has had a tremendous influence on horror literature and horror cinema. Several adaptations have been produced, and several other films have been inspired by the tale. The plot of the novella follows a governess who arrives at the estate of Bly to care for two orphaned children, Miles and Flora. As time passes, the governess starts seeing two haunting figures roaming the estate. She soon learns about the servants Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, both recently deceased. The governess believes that the ghosts have come back to influence and sway the children, but nobody else admits to seeing them, especially not Flora or Miles. The governess grows sure the children are lying to her, and she believes it is up to her to free the kids from the wicked supernatural influence. The tale ends with a dramatic and deadly confrontation between the governess and young Miles.
Here, and you must say his name!
The novella is complex, allowing the reader to make several potential interpretations of the haunting. Thus, some readers claim the ghosts of Peter Quint and Miss Jessel aren't real, but instead are the figments of the mentally ill governess's imagination. Others claim the ghosts have to be real, and that the story should be taken literally. Either way, whether the ghosts were real or imagined, the book rocked me to my core when I read it at age 13. After the story's downbeat end, I walked around shell-shocked for days. It remains one of my favorite reads. Ghostly flickers of Henry James's story appear in many supernatural tales, haunting them like a specter of literature past. Several psychological aspects of The Turn of the Screw were adopted by the ghost genre wholesale, thus becoming tropes repeated in later works. For instance, the novella's psychological ambiguity kept the readers off guard. Are the ghosts real, or are they not?
Sometimes one can't help imagining things.
Here's another variation on the trope. Are the ghosts seen only by a select few, but unseen to most others? The Turn of the Screw was one of the last major ghost stories written under Queen Victoria's rule, now known as the Victorian era, lasting from 1837 to 1901. Thus, the story became a bridge between the Victorian ghost yarns and the 20th century ghost story. It has the moody doom and gloom of the Victorian stories, while placing front and center the scarred mentality of ghost story protagonists, as so often seen in later ghost tales. So let's take a deeper look at some of the themes of The Turn of the Screw, and then chart how they've haunted later ghost stories. Even though Henry James was born an American, he spent most of his life as an expatriate in Europe. His output was often tied to the old world culture and literary tradition, and at the end of his life, he became a British subject. This was, we have to remember, an era when the British Empire practically ruled the world. In short, James's authorship was determined by his life experiences, and his works often feature and question and depict this old world European society. One theme particularly popular at the time was the threat to innocence. Ghost stories were a big part of Victorian literature, and haunted houses feature heavily in English folklore. The Victorian haunted mansions often dealt with issues of social standing and class, as almost anything British is wont to do. Class thus matters in The Turn of the Screw, where the servants are cruel ghosts preying on innocent upper-class children. The hero of the story, the unnamed governess, tells the story from the first-person perspective, but that doesn't include the first chapter framing device. As a governess, she does not belong to the upper echelons, but her rank is superior to that of valet Peter Quint. While alive, former governess Miss Jessel had a sexual relationship with Peter Quint, consequently sullying her slightly elevated social standing. Note that Peter Quint is not called Mr. Quint, signifying he was the lowest ranking character in the story. The governess, who would be more middle class than working class, strives to maintain the social system she knows by protecting the children. This focus on class is significant because the Victorian era was also the era of the Industrial Revolution. People no longer lived rural lives, instead moving to cities. The middle class was born, and the governess, as already mentioned, belonged to that social class. And many among the middle class employed servants at this point in history, and though society was changing and modernizing, the British had a hard time letting go of their upstairs-downstairs social system. It should be noted that this does not apply to the 1961 Jack Clayton directed adaptation of the story, where the governess, here named Miss Giddens, is said to have come from a highly dogmatic religious background. She is the daughter of a preacher, and the focus is more on her repression and her innocence in the face of a darker sexual power. More on that to come. In the early 20th century, as cinema was evolving, the British viewed the film industry as something of a lower-class art form. Film historian Kevin Brownlow called this a missed opportunity in his documentary series Cinema Europe, The Other Hollywood. He lamented that the UK film industry didn't strive to elevate and develop its cinematic language, unlike the Germans, the French, the Swedes, and the Americans. Because of this, early British cinema wasn't a popular export. The result was that relatively few Victorian-era style haunted mansion films were made. Thus, the turn of the screw didn't influence early horror film history, which took more inspiration from other literary sources, such as exotic monsters, mad scientists, angry apes, and creations of science. When the horror genre did focus on ghost stories, it usually portrayed the spirits as comical, or as a hoax by a villain pretending to be a ghost in order to steal some sort of inheritance. Or the adaptations came from gentler ghost stories, like A Christmas Carol or The Canterville Ghost. Henry James's spectres had yet to make a chilling entry. However, the British film industry grew in esteem and innovation during the early days of sound. Not only did the UK export films by talented directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Michael Powell, David Lean, and Sultan Korda, but the fact that these films were made in English made them far more sellable than other European fare. As a result, British culture began an invasion of Hollywood, one that continues to this very day.
The perfect partner.
Then, in the early 1940s, someone at Paramount Pictures decided to make a ghost story that depicted spirits with the same kind of psychological maliciousness as Peter Quint and Miss Jessel. The resulting film was The Uninvited, released in 1944. It was an American production, but significantly, it was set in the UK, specifically at a small mansion called Windward House. Though placing the story in England likely has more to do with the grand tradition of British ghost stories than it had to do with Henry James. The Uninvited, being an American film with an American protagonist, doesn't focus much on class issues, nor does it delve deep into the traumatic and sexual aspects of Henry James's story. But the ghosts in The Uninvited do influence the actions of the living, kind of like how Quint and Jessel influenced Flora and Miles, seeking to control them. Then again, it's a reach to say that the film was directly influenced by Henry James. The Uninvited isn't truly haunted by the turn of the screw, it is merely part of the same ectoplasmic species. But it is an important film, because it set the stage for other filmmakers to delve into Henry James' territory. The movie was a gateway horror film to more serious modern ghost adaptations, just like The Turn of the Screw was a gateway into more serious, psychologically inquisitive ghost literature. This, combined with a re-emerging interest in all things Victorian during the 1950s, paved the way for a true adaptation of Henry James's novella. The Innocents, from which we've already seen several clips, followed in 1961. The film wasn't the massive hit it deserved to be. Only recently has it gotten a critical re-evaluation. Sadly, critics in 1961 were divided about it, accusing the film of straddling the line between serious filmmaking and hammer horror schlock. I find that to be an insult to both The Innocents and to hammer horror. These are works that reflected their era and that delve deep into contemporary culture. Hammer films deserve their own episode, but for now, let's take a closer look at The Innocents. This was the first cinematic adaptation of the Henry James story, and it remains the best one. Its strength comes from the ability and skill of director Jack Clayton, leading lady Deborah Carr, the excellent supporting cast, the crew, and screenwriters William Archibald and Truman Capote. Together, they fully embrace the ambiguity of Henry James's novel, constantly and craftily questioning whether or not the ghosts are in the governess's mind, or if they are indeed real. They never let up on this ambiguity, making it central to the film's character development.
Kiss me good night, Miss Giddens.
This scene reportedly caused an uproar when screened for 20th Century Fox executives. Clayton had to fight to keep it, and he won, which is a good thing, for the scene is among the most important in The Innocents. It plays on Miss Giddens' repressed sexual nature and her attraction to little Miles's uncle, here played by Michael Redgrave, only appearing in a single scene in the opening of the film. Seen through Miss Giddens' eyes, Miles here channels the raw, dangerous sexuality of the ghostly Peter Quint. It is Quint kissing her, not the child. Miss Giddens' sexual repression from her own vicar's daughter childhood clashes with Peter Quint's violent working-class sexual energy, and with her own disturbing way of seeing Miles. She has, until this point, viewed the boy as a surrogate for his uncle, focusing on the boy in an inappropriate way. Disturbing content indeed. According to film historian Christopher Frayling, who has an excellent analysis of The Innocents on the Criterion Collection release, these elements were likely added by screenwriter Truman Capote. But the dark sexual nature was not unique to only the 1961 film. They were also present in the Henry James novella in 1898. Literary critic Craig Raine makes a compelling point that Victorian readers would identify Peter Quint and Miss Jessel as child molesters. In essence, this meant that disturbed, repressed, and dangerous sexuality is a part of what makes the book haunting. Of course, this ugly spectre appears again in The Innocents, albeit in a different context. Here, the governess herself is part of the horror, her own repressed sexual nature dangerously affecting the plot.
Don't worry, there's a man in the house.
Is there?
Yes, me.
It was an evil house from the beginning. A house that was born bad.
2 years after The Innocents was released, director Robert Wise filmed Shirley Jackson's landmark horror novel, The Haunting of Hill House. The resulting film, The Haunting, did okay at the box office, but like The Innocents, it didn't break any records. Still, it managed, along with The Innocents and The Uninvited, to firmly establish the link between cinema and the classic haunted mansion story as interpreted by Henry James. These films are today considered horror classics. Their cultural impact then and now made it easier for Henry James's story DNA to manifest elsewhere. Yes, movies had creepy haunted houses before, but the approach was different and usually far more innocent. Several haunted house films followed after The Innocents and The Haunting, and many of these feature films are great, but we can't cover them all, not unless this video essay becomes feature-length. Skipping ahead to our own millennium, there are 2 more films we should take a closer look at. Both films are haunted by the turn of the screw, but one more so than the other. The more recent film I want to discuss is director Guillermo del Toro's highly underrated Crimson Peak. This splendid film is a ghost story that draws heavily on previous atmospheric tales, and it is proud of its heritage, demonstrating this with a heroine that is an author of ghost stories, and thus an advocate for their importance. The film probably has more in common with atmospheric literary works like Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and Rebecca, but it also has a dash of Henry James. Guillermo del Toro has stated he wanted to pay homage to these books, as well as the grand old dames of haunted house films, The Haunting and The Innocents. Del Toro and his co-writer Matthew Robbins weave a plot that touches on the death of the British aristocracy and how it has become outdated and incestuously small. They reverse the motif from Henry James, now with the new world threatened by the old one, as opposed to Henry James's version, where the new world of Peter Quint's social elevation threatens the old. Crimson Peak also pays homage to the sense of isolation of the estate, but unlike the old solid stones of Bly, Adderdale Hall is decaying outwardly, collapsing and sinking into the crimson soil. The biggest link is in the film's dark exploration of sexual love. It soon becomes clear to its heroine that her husband and his sister have a sexual relationship. Not exactly the same as the child molester interpretation of Henry James's novella, but it is an exploration of a dark sexual taboo, and thus a ghostly reminder of the turn of the screw.
Why did you fight?
It was the old woman. With the strange eyes, she was imitating my daughter's voice.
For our final film, the haunting likeness is overwhelming. If you haven't seen The Others, and if you love ghost stories, what are you waiting for? The Others, like The Turn of the Screw, deals with a lead character who tries to protect 2 kids, a boy and a girl, but in this case, they are her own biological children. She considers them to be in danger from evil influences, such as sunlight, and later on in the story, the actual servants themselves. And then, the servants are revealed to be ghosts, like Peter Quint and Miss Jessel. But not quite. These are not evil spirits. Madness certainly plays a huge part in this story. Writer-director Alejandro Amenabar doesn't go for the same kind of ambiguity as Henry James did, and Nicole Kidman's lead character is revealed to be insane.
Is that how she killed you? With a pillow?
Well, rather, she was insane when she murdered her own children and then herself, turning them all into ghosts, trapping them in limbo. Filicide, the act of a parent killing their child, here replaces the taboos explored in The Turn of the Screw. This subject, as well as the themes, the ending, the mental state of the female lead character, and the foggy, moody, gloomy estate, they all echo Henry James's original story. I believe this is very much an intentional choice, as Amenabar is a highly literate director who makes highly literate films. Like Henry James, Alejandro Amenabar isn't trying to frighten us with a boo scare, but rather he wants to give us a psychological scar, just like the one I received when I first read The Turn of the Screw. Both works succeed at their goal, and they share that same feeling of dread and trauma at the conclusion of their tales. There are several other excellent ghost stories that I didn't cover here. You could check out the stellar ghost movie The Changeling, or you could read the superb Michelle Paver novel Dark Matter, or you could check out what is perhaps my favorite Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House, which was very loosely adapted from Shirley Jackson's classic novel. And this last sample is particularly interesting with regards to Henry James. After the successful first season, Netflix ordered another. As the story had a conclusive ending, the filmmakers needed a new ghost story to adapt for season 2. And of course, they chose to make a version of The Turn of the Screw, putting the estate of Bly front and center. Henry James's story has haunted the supernatural genre, with traces of it appearing as a ghostly reminder in the way only a dark idea can. And in doing so, it has left behind little pieces of itself: mood, class, psychology, atmosphere, and character development. We are truly lucky to have such a great, complex, and spellbinding ghost in our cultural heritage. My name is Wolf Craft. This is History of Horror. If you liked the episode, I'd sure appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed. Also, if you want to check out some of my other works, I'm an author. My science fiction novel God of Desolation is currently available on Amazon. Due to the COVID pandemic, my upcoming mystery novel Richly Drawn has been delayed by a year until fall 2021, but it will be available for pre-order on inkshares.com sometime in the future. Thanks a plenty.